December 19, 1944. Beneath the streets of Whitehall, the British War Room pulsed with the low, constant hum of urgency. Maps were spread across long tables, their surfaces scarred by weeks of anxious revisions. Red and blue pins marked positions that refused to stay still. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air, clinging to uniforms and nerves alike. At the center of it all stood Winston Churchill, his shoulders heavy, his expression darker than usual. He crushed out the remains of his cigar and stared at the map of Western Europe as if it were a living thing that had betrayed him. The German counteroffensive through the Ardennes had erupted with terrifying force. What intelligence had dismissed as an exhausted enemy's last gasp had become a roaring assault. A 50-mile bulge had torn into the Allied line, threatening to split American and British forces cleanly in two. Reports were grim. Supply routes were collapsing. Units were surrounded. Snow and ice had grounded Allied aircraft, blinding reconnaissance and silencing air support. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's assessment was methodical, cautious, and chilling. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks to organize a counterattack capable of restoring the front. 3 weeks was an eternity the Allies did not possess. Churchill's military secretary, General Hastings Ismay, stood nearby, watching the Prime Minister closely. Years of war had taught him to read every shift of Churchill's face. He had seen anger, defiance, despair. What he saw now was something different, the look of a man bracing himself for catastrophe. Then the telegram arrived. It bore the mark of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Churchill took it from Ismay, read it once, then again. The war room seemed to quiet around him, as if the building itself sensed something unusual. When he finally looked up, the familiar growl returned to his voice, but now it carried a sharp edge of disbelief. "Gentlemen," he said, "it appears General Patton has just promised Eisenhower that he will have 3 divisions attacking north within 48 hours. The room froze. 48 hours. Churchill let the words settle, allowing their absurdity to sink in. Third Army sat nearly 90 miles south of Bastogne, facing east toward Germany. To strike north, Patton would need to disengage from active combat, rotate his entire army 90 degrees, and advance through snow-choked roads under constant threat, all while keeping his supply lines intact. Either, Churchill continued slowly, the man is a military genius, or he is a magnificent liar. A brief pause. I suspect both. What no one in that room could yet grasp was that this moment marked the beginning of one of the most audacious operational maneuvers in modern warfare, and the moment when Churchill's understanding of armored warfare would begin to change forever. To understand why Patton's promise bordered on madness, one must understand the scale of what he commanded. George S. Patton led the U.S. Third Army. 6 divisions, nearly 250,000 men, over 100,000 vehicles, and tens of thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. Armies of that size did not turn on a whim. They lumbered. They required planning measured in weeks, not hours. The road network in eastern France and Luxembourg was fragile even under ideal conditions. Narrow routes twisted through forests and villages never meant to support mechanized armies. In winter, those roads became death traps, icy, clogged, and barely passable. Every doctrine taught to Allied staff officers warned against sudden mass redeployment under such conditions. Major General John Milliken, commander of 3 Corps, had been present days earlier when Dwight D. Eisenhower asked Patton how quickly he could relieve the crisis in the Ardennes. When Patton replied 48 hours, Milliken later wrote that he thought the old man had finally lost his mind. The logistics calculations alone, he believed, would take a week just to outline. What Milliken, and nearly everyone else, did not know was that Patton had already been planning for this moment. 3 days earlier, on December 16th, As German artillery thundered across the Ardennes and Allied commanders scrambled to understand the scope of the attack, Patton had reached a very different conclusion. Where others saw disaster, he saw opportunity. A bulge, after all, was something that could be cut off, if one moved fast enough. That same day, Patton summoned his staff. He did not rage or panic. According to those present, he was calm, focused, almost energized. Colonel Paul Harkins, his deputy chief of staff, later recalled Patton's words with perfect clarity. "The Krauts have stuck their head in a meat grinder," Patton said. "Somebody just needs to turn the handle. That somebody is going to be us." Behind the bravado lay preparation. Patton ordered his planners to develop not one, but 3 contingency plans for a rapid pivot north. Logistics officers quietly repositioned fuel dumps. Engineers reviewed routes that might support mass movement in winter. Corps commanders were warned to be ready for sudden orders that would overturn weeks of planning. Patton was not improvising. He was waiting. When Eisenhower finally asked for help, Patton was not making a promise. He was unveiling a decision already made. Back in London, Churchill began receiving hourly updates. At first, he assumed the reports were exaggerated. American enthusiasm had a reputation for outpacing reality. But by December 20th, skepticism gave way to unease. Patton's lead elements had already covered 30 miles and secured critical crossroads. Movement was continuing at a pace British planners considered unsustainable. A message from Eisenhower's intelligence chief, Major General Kenneth Strong, reached Whitehall with unusual urgency. "Third Army is moving faster than our own intelligence can track them," it read. "Road march discipline is extraordinary. Patton appears to have planned this operation days before anyone authorized it." For Churchill, this struck at the heart of a long-standing tension. Throughout the war, he had balanced American aggression against British caution. Montgomery, his favored general, embodied methodical warfare, build overwhelming force, minimize risk, never attack until victory was mathematically assured. Patton embodied something far more unsettling: speed, instinct, and relentless forward motion. Churchill admired boldness, but he feared recklessness. History had taught him that wars were often lost by men who mistook audacity for genius. Yet as the reports continued, something in his assessment began to shift. On December 21st, Churchill dictated a note to his chiefs of staff. "Whatever one thinks of General Patton's methods or manners," he said, "one cannot dispute his results. Third Army has moved further in 2 days than we moved in 2 weeks during Normandy. There is something to be learned here, even if it makes our own doctrine uncomfortable." The Germans were learning the same lesson, more painfully. At OB West headquarters, intercepted American radio traffic painted an alarming picture. Units of a size the Germans believed immobile were appearing in unexpected sectors with shocking speed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reportedly remarked that Patton did not operate with reserves. He operated with momentum. Winter should have stopped everything. Temperatures plunged below 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow buried vehicles. Ice-coated bridges. Visibility dropped to near zero. These conditions were supposed to paralyze mechanized warfare. Instead, Patton treated them as irrelevant. "The enemy is suffering the same weather," he told his commanders. "The difference is, we're moving." As Churchill absorbed these developments, the impossible began to feel merely improbable. The war room beneath Whitehall, once heavy with dread, now buzzed with a different kind of tension. The uneasy realization that the rules governing modern warfare might be changing in real time, and that a profane, controversial American general was forcing Britain's greatest wartime leader to reconsider everything he thought he knew about speed, risk, and victory. By the morning of December 20th, 1944, the impossible was no longer theoretical. It was happening. Along frozen roads in eastern France and Luxembourg, columns of American vehicles stretched beyond the horizon. Tanks crawled forward in low gear, engines roaring against the cold. Trucks skidded through snow-choked villages, headlights hooded, drivers gripping their wheels with numb hands. Infantry marched beside the armor, boots crunching over ice, breath hanging in white clouds that vanished into the gray sky. This was not a movement planned in comfort. It was a full-bodied wrench of an army out of one fight and into another, while both fights were still ongoing. At 3rd Army headquarters, George S. Patton refused to slow the pace. Orders were short, blunt, and uncompromising. There would be no pauses to tidy supply lines, no delays for perfect coordination. Momentum was everything. Time, Patton believed, was not something you managed. It was something you spent. What made the maneuver extraordinary was not merely its speed, but its geometry. Armies are designed to move forward. Their supply systems, communications networks, and command structures all face one direction. Patton was asking his entire organization to pivot 90 degrees, as if a massive door were being swung on rusted hinges while under fire. Fuel dumps positioned for an eastward thrust toward Germany suddenly had to support a northern advance into Belgium. Ammunition loads tailored for one set of engagements were redirected to another. Engineers raced ahead to inspect bridges they had never expected to use. Traffic control points were established on the fly, manned by military police standing in snowstorms, waving endless convoys through narrow intersections. In peacetime exercises, such a maneuver would have been judged reckless. In winter combat, it bordered on insanity. Yet it worked, because Patton had quietly laid the groundwork before anyone asked him to move. While other Allied commanders were still debating German intentions, Patton's staff had already mapped likely axes of advance north. Corps commanders had been warned that sudden orders might arrive without explanation. Logistics officers had been told to expect chaos and to embrace it rather than fight it. Colonel Walter Müller, 3rd Army's chief logistics officer, later admitted that he had initially thought the plan would collapse under its own weight. "We were redirecting 60,000 tons of supplies while the Army was still in contact with the enemy," he recalled. "By doctrine, that shouldn't be possible." Doctrine did not matter to Patton. Results did. By the end of December 20th, lead elements of 3rd Army had already advanced 30 miles. This alone defied Allied expectations. But more unsettling was how little friction they encountered. German units, expecting American forces to remain fixed or disorganized, were repeatedly surprised by sudden contact from directions they believed safe. German intelligence struggled to keep pace. Intercepts suggested large American movements, but analysts dismissed them as fragmented withdrawals or local counterattacks. The idea that an entire army was pivoting north at full speed seemed implausible. At Whitehall, Churchill studied each update with growing intensity. His initial reaction had been disbelief. Now it was curiosity, and something approaching admiration. He had spent years defending careful, methodical operations as the only responsible way to wage war. Yet here was Patton achieving in hours what British planners assumed required weeks. On December 21st, Churchill received confirmation that Patton's spearhead had secured key road junctions essential for any relief of Bastogne. The significance was immediate. Without those crossroads, any attempt to reach the encircled 101st Airborne Division would bog down into piecemeal attacks. Instead, 3rd Army flowed forward. Major General Manton Eddy, commanding 14th Corps, wrote to his wife that night, "We're marching through conditions that would make Napoleon's retreat from Moscow look like a spring picnic. But the old man won't hear of delay. He keeps saying the enemy is freezing too." This attitude filtered down the chain of command. Officers learned quickly that excuses carried little weight. Solutions mattered. When vehicles broke down, crews cannibalized parts from disabled trucks by the roadside. When fuel ran low, units siphoned from any source they could find. When roads clogged, Commanders rerouted entire columns without waiting for approval. Patton trusted his subordinates and demanded they trust him. The weather, which should have been the great equalizer, instead became a weapon. Snow grounded Allied aircraft, yes, but it grounded German air power as well. Fog limited reconnaissance, but it also concealed American movements. Patton pushed relentlessly, betting that confusion would favor the side willing to move fastest. By December 22nd, the implications were unmistakable. Advanced elements of the 4th Armored Division were within striking distance of Bastogne. The town, held by the encircled 101st Airborne Division, had become the symbolic heart of the German offensive. If Bastogne fell, the German timetable might still survive. If it held and was relieved, the entire offensive risked collapse. Inside Bastogne, conditions were desperate. Medical supplies were gone. Ammunition was rationed by the clip. Frostbite claimed nearly as many men as enemy fire. When German envoys demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," became legend. But legend alone would not stop tanks. Churchill followed Bastogne's fate with personal concern. He had met airborne troops earlier in the war and admired their resilience. The thought of them being sacrificed to delays and miscalculation gnawed at him. On December 22nd, his military secretary entered the war room with new reports. Patton's lead units were engaged south of Bastogne. Not probing, engaged. Churchill reportedly stopped mid-sentence, stared at the map and said quietly, "Good God, the man is actually doing it." For German commanders, this moment marked the beginning of the end of their offensive illusion. General officers who had believed the Allies slow, predictable, and dependent on air superiority now faced a different reality. American armor was advancing through winter conditions with a tempo reminiscent of Germany's own blitzkrieg campaigns earlier in the war. One German regimental commander later wrote that the most frightening aspect was not the firepower, but the speed. "We could not reposition fast enough," he said. By the time we reacted, they were already elsewhere. By December 23rd, Third Army's momentum had become irreversible. Patton had forced a new operational reality onto both sides. The question was no longer whether Bastogne could be relieved, but whether German forces could stop the relief in time. Back in London, Churchill began to understand the deeper lesson unfolding before him. This was not recklessness. It was a different philosophy of war, one in which speed itself became decisive, compressing the enemy's decision cycle until resistance unraveled. As the snow continued to fall and engines growled northward, the fate of Bastogne and the judgment of history hung on whether Patton's gamble could survive its final test. The breakthrough was coming, but first it would have to be fought for, mile by frozen mile. By Christmas Eve 1944, the Ardennes had become a frozen labyrinth of fire and confusion. Snow fell in heavy sheets, muting sound and swallowing landmarks. Roads vanished beneath ice. Forests became mazes where men fought at distances so close they could hear each other breathe. In this chaos, the fate of Bastogne hung by a thread. For the encircled 101st Airborne Division, time had ceased to exist as a future concept. Every hour was survival. Every night felt endless. Wounded men lay wrapped in blankets stiff with frost, morphine rationed as carefully as ammunition. Artillery shells were counted. Rifle rounds were saved for moments when targets were unmistakable. Outside the perimeter, German forces tightened the ring. Armor probed weak points. Infantry assaults came in waves, testing resolve as much as defenses. The Germans believed the Americans were isolated, exhausted, and running out of options. They were right, about everything except one thing. Patton was coming. South of Bastogne, the 4th Armored Division advanced into a wall of resistance. German commanders, finally grasping what was happening, threw everything they could spare into blocking the approach. Anti-tank guns were hidden in tree lines. Panthers and tigers lurked at road bends. Bridges were blown just hours before American columns reached them. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the lead task force, quickly understood the stakes. This was not a methodical advance. It was a race against collapse. Orders from Third Army were unmistakable. Keep moving. Do not stop. Do not wait for perfect alignment. Break through. The fighting was brutal and intimate. Tanks fired at muzzle flash range. Infantry advanced through knee-deep snow under machine gun fire. When roads were blocked, engineers worked under fire to clear them or bypass them. When German strongpoints refused to yield, Abrams pushed around them, leaving follow-on units to mop up. This approach unsettled German defenders. They had expected careful American assaults, preceded by artillery preparation and followed by consolidation. Instead, Patton's forces surged forward, ignoring flanks, bypassing resistance, appearing where they were not supposed to be. On December 25th, Christmas Day, Patton sent a message to his commanders that captured his mindset perfectly. "Attack relentlessly," it read. "We must relieve Bastogne tomorrow." No qualifiers, no contingency language. Tomorrow. Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers did not know this message existed. They only knew the pressure was increasing. German loudspeakers called on them to surrender, promising good treatment. The response remained defiant, but privately, officers wondered how much longer they could hold. That night, snow gave way to freezing rain. Foxholes filled with icy water. Weapons malfunctioned. Men slept in short bursts, waking to explosions and shouted warnings. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, artillery thundered. Not German, but American. At first, it was distant, then closer. On the afternoon of December 26th, Abrams' lead tanks reached the village of Assenois, 4 miles southwest of Bastogne. German resistance stiffened into a final barrier. This was the last chance to stop the relief. The engagement was fierce and chaotic. Abrams personally led the advance, standing in his turret, scanning through binoculars despite sniper fire. When a Sherman was knocked out, another rolled past it without slowing. Infantry clung to the armor, dismounting only when absolutely necessary. At 4:45 p.m., the moment arrived. Abrams' tanks broke through the German line and made contact with elements of the 101st Airborne. The radio transmission crackled across the net. Contact made. Corridor established. Inside Bastogne, word spread like electricity. Men who had barely spoken in days began to shout, laugh, and cry. Some fired flares into the sky. Others simply sat down in the snow, exhausted beyond expression. They were alive. The relief of Bastogne was not just a tactical success. It was a psychological earthquake. For the Germans, it shattered the core assumption of their offensive, that the Allies would react slowly, cautiously, predictably. Instead, they had been outpaced, outmaneuvered, and outthought under conditions that favored defense. For the Americans, it became instant legend. The image of Patton's tanks rolling through the snow to save a surrounded division crystallized everything soldiers wanted to believe about leadership, determination, and victory. And for Winston Churchill, watching events unfold from London, it was a revelation. When news of the breakthrough reached Whitehall, Churchill reportedly fell silent, a rare occurrence. He read the telegram once, then again. According to those present, he finally leaned back and said softly, "Gentlemen, we have just witnessed something rare in warfare. A commander who makes the impossible routine." This was more than praise. It was an admission. For months, Churchill had defended slow, deliberate operations as the price of minimizing casualties. Now, he had watched Patton achieve in 7 days what Allied planners had predicted would take 3 weeks. Under worse conditions, against determined opposition, and without the luxury of air superiority. The numbers were staggering. Third Army had moved 6 divisions nearly 90 miles, fought multiple engagements, captured thousands of prisoners, and relieved a surrounded force, all while maintaining offensive pressure. Losses were significant, but far lower than anyone had feared. German commanders were equally stunned. Post-war interrogations revealed that many had believed Patton's movement impossible until the moment his tanks appeared. One officer admitted, "We were fighting time itself, and time was on their side." Churchill grasped the broader implication almost immediately. Bastogne was not just a saved town. It was proof that the Allies had achieved operational superiority at a level the Germans could no longer match. Surprise was no longer something achieved only through deception. It could be achieved through speed alone. In a private conversation days later, Churchill observed that Patton treated time like ammunition, something to be spent aggressively, not hoarded. Every delay, he said, was a bullet wasted. As the snow continued to fall over the Ardennes, the German offensive began to wither. The bulge that had threatened to split the Allied front now became a trap, its attackers forced onto the defensive. Patton had not merely relieved Bastogne. He had broken the rhythm of the enemy's war, and in doing so, he forced Britain's greatest wartime leader to confront an uncomfortable truth. The future of warfare might belong not to the cautious, but to the fast. The war would never look the same again. In the days following Bastogne's relief, the fighting in the Ardennes did not immediately end, but the war's momentum had shifted in a way few could mistake. German forces still resisted fiercely, but the illusion of control was gone. What had begun as a bold counteroffensive now looked increasingly like a gamble that had failed its most critical test: speed. From London, Winston Churchill studied the unfolding situation with growing intensity. For years, he had defended Britain's methodical approach to warfare as not merely prudent, but morally necessary. Britain had already paid dearly in blood. Caution, he believed, was the price of survival. Yet Patton's dash to Bastogne had achieved something unsettling. It delivered decisive results without the long attritional grind Churchill had assumed unavoidable. On December 27th, Churchill received the confirmed after-action reports. Third Army had captured over 15,000 German prisoners, destroyed or seized hundreds of enemy vehicles, and inflicted casualties that far outweighed its own losses. All of it accomplished during one of the harshest winters in memory. The Prime Minister sat quietly as his advisors discussed the figures. This silence concerned them more than any outburst would have. When Churchill finally spoke, his tone was reflective rather than triumphant. "We have been taught," he said, "that preparation saves lives. Yet here we see preparation married to speed, achieving what caution alone could not. The contrast between commanders could not have been clearer." Field Marshal Montgomery, Churchill's longtime favorite, represented discipline, control, and certainty. His operations unfolded like carefully constructed arguments, each premise established before the next step was allowed. Patton's operation, by comparison, looked like controlled chaos, overlapping decisions, decentralized initiative, and relentless pressure. For years, Churchill had supported Montgomery against American criticism, defending his slower tempo as professionalism rather than timidity. Bastogne forced him to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that the British approach, while safe, might also be limiting. In a memo dictated to his chiefs of staff, Churchill wrote, "Patton's movement challenges our assumptions about what is possible at the operational level. We must ask ourselves whether our insistence on perfect conditions has sometimes denied us decisive opportunities." This was no small admission. Churchill was not merely praising an American general. He was questioning decades of British military tradition shaped by the trauma of World War I. His chief military advisor, General Sir Alan Brooke, was far less impressed. In his diary, Brooke dismissed the operation as dangerously reliant on luck. Yes, he conceded, Patton had succeeded, but success did not make the method sound. "One does not plan wars," Brooke wrote, "on the assumption that fortune will always favor boldness." Churchill understood Brooke's argument. He had made it himself many times, but Bastogne refused to fit neatly into that framework. This was not a lucky breakthrough or a reckless charge that somehow worked. It was a deliberate exploitation of time, anticipation, and decentralized command. German reactions reinforced the point. Intercepted communications revealed mounting confusion within the German high command. Units redeployed to counter Patton's thrust arrived too late or in the wrong places. Intelligence reports contradicted each other. Commanders struggled to understand how American forces were appearing where they should not have been able to reach. In Berlin, the relief of Bastogne sent shockwaves through strategic planning. The Ardennes offensive had been predicated on slow Allied reaction. Once that assumption collapsed, so did the timetable. German reserves were insufficient. Fuel shortages worsened. Initiative slipped away, and with it, the last realistic chance of altering the war's outcome in the West. Churchill grasped this strategic implication immediately. Bastogne was not merely a saved garrison, it was proof that the Allies had crossed a threshold. They could now move faster than German decision-making cycles. Surprise no longer depended on secrecy, it depended on speed. In a private conversation with his physician, Lord Moran, Churchill framed the lesson with characteristic clarity. "Patton treats time as ammunition," he said. "He spends it freely, knowing it cannot be saved. We have been far too careful with ours." This idea lingered. In early January 1945, as Allied planners debated the next major operations, Churchill began using Bastogne as a benchmark. During discussions about crossing the Rhine, he challenged his staff bluntly. "Patton moved 6 divisions 90 miles in winter storms," he said. "We are debating whether 2 divisions can move 30 miles in fair weather." The room reportedly fell quiet. Montgomery bristled at the implication. His response was sharp. American forces, he argued, could afford higher risk and greater material expenditure. Britain could not. Lives and resources had to be conserved. Churchill did not disagree, but he did not retreat. "Perhaps," he replied, "or perhaps we have confused caution with wisdom." This exchange marked a subtle but profound shift. Churchill was not abandoning his belief in preparation or coordination. He was questioning whether those virtues had hardened into constraints. Publicly, Churchill remained diplomatic. In a speech to Parliament reviewing the Battle of the Bulge, he praised Allied cooperation and resilience. But he made a pointed reference to the relief of Bastogne, calling it an example of bold leadership married to careful preparation. The House of Commons understood the subtext. Applause followed, longer and louder than usual. Privately, Churchill went further. In a letter to George C. Marshall, he wrote, "General Patton's conduct during the Ardennes has demonstrated capabilities we must strive to replicate. His ability to redirect large forces rapidly while sustaining combat effectiveness represents a standard of operational excellence." For Churchill, this was unusually generous language. He was acknowledging not only success, but superiority in method. What impressed him most was not the tanks or the bravery. Those were expected. It was the orchestration, the logistics, the trust in subordinates, the willingness to accept temporary disorder in exchange for irreversible momentum. This was not cowboy warfare, Churchill later remarked. It was brilliantly orchestrated chaos. As winter dragged on and Allied forces pushed the Germans back toward their borders, the implications of Bastogne continued to echo through planning rooms on both sides of the Atlantic. British officers found themselves reassessing long-held assumptions about tempo and control. American commanders gained confidence that speed itself could substitute for numerical or positional advantage. Churchill, ever the student of history, began framing Patton's achievement in broader terms. He compared it privately to the great maneuvers of the past, to Marlborough, to Napoleon, to Nelson. Commanders who acted not when conditions were perfect, but when opportunity briefly revealed itself. History, Churchill mused, rarely rewards those who wait for certainty. By the time Allied armies approached the Rhine, Churchill's thinking had evolved in ways few would have predicted a year earlier. He remained loyal to Montgomery. He still valued caution, but he now understood something Patton had demonstrated with startling clarity. In modern mechanized warfare, hesitation could be deadlier than risk. Bastogne had not only saved a division, it had changed how Britain's wartime leader understood the nature of victory itself. And that realization would shape the final months of the war and the way it would be remembered, far more than Churchill yet realized. By early January 1945, the Ardennes offensive was no longer a question mark. It was a failure. German forces still fought, still killed, still delayed, but the vision that had driven the counteroffensive was gone. The Allied front had not shattered. It had bent, absorbed the blow, and snapped back harder than before. At the center of that reversal stood the relief of Bastogne. For Winston Churchill, the operation lingered in his thoughts long after the immediate crisis passed. He had witnessed many dramatic moments during the war: Dunkirk, El Alamein, Normandy. But Bastogne was different. It was not a grand set-piece battle. It was a demonstration, quiet, relentless, and deeply unsettling to established assumptions. What disturbed Churchill most was how thoroughly Patton's success undermined traditional limits. The movement to Bastogne had exceeded what British doctrine considered sustainable for mechanized forces. Staff manuals insisted that armies required rest cycles, logistical stabilization, and phased planning. Patton had violated every one of those principles and still delivered decisive results. In conversations with his advisors, Churchill began asking questions that would have seemed unthinkable earlier in the war. Had Britain been too cautious? Had the fear of casualties hardened into operational paralysis? Had an obsession with control slowed decision-making at moments when speed might have saved lives rather than cost them? These were not abstract concerns. They touched the core of how Britain had fought the war. German reactions reinforced the lesson. Post-war interrogations revealed that Bastogne marked a psychological breaking point for many German commanders. General officers admitted that once Patton's tanks reached the town, they understood the offensive had failed in spirit as well as substance. Surprise was gone. Initiative was lost. One captured German general put it bluntly: "After Bastogne, we were no longer fighting Allied units. We were fighting Allied time." That phrase resonated with Churchill. He understood its meaning intuitively. War, at its highest level, was not merely about territory or firepower. It was about forcing the enemy to react faster than they could think. Patton had not simply broken through German lines, he had broken their decision cycle. This realization followed Churchill into the war's final months. As Allied armies advanced toward the Rhine, planning conferences once dominated by caution now included uncomfortable comparisons. Churchill repeatedly cited Third Army's performance when discussions bogged down. "We have seen what is possible," he would say. "Let us not pretend otherwise." This put him at odds with Field Marshal Montgomery more than once. Montgomery continued to argue that Patton's methods worked only because American resources were vast and losses acceptable. Britain, he insisted, could not afford such risks. Churchill's reply, recorded by multiple witnesses, was sharp. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps speed itself saves lives by ending wars sooner." The war ended before that debate could fully resolve itself. On May 8, 1945, victory in Europe was declared. In his public speeches, Churchill praised Allied unity and collective sacrifice. But he made a point, subtle, unmistakable, to highlight Third Army's achievements. "General Patton's Third Army," he said, "covered more ground, liberated more territory, and captured more enemy soldiers than any comparable Allied formation. Their relief of Bastogne stands as a testament to what bold leadership can achieve. For those who understood Churchill's long-standing reluctance to praise American generals, the statement carried enormous weight. Privately, Churchill went further. In conversations recorded by his physician, Lord Moran, Churchill spoke of Patton with a tone that surprised even close confidants. He acknowledged Patton's flaws openly, his temper, his recklessness with words, his political blindness. But he returned again and again to results. "The man wins," Churchill said, "and he wins quickly." He compared Patton to figures from Britain's own martial past, most notably Lord Nelson. Both were aggressive, personally difficult, and deeply uncomfortable for bureaucratic systems. Both, Churchill observed, made conventional commanders nervous. And both, when unleashed, achieved victories others could not. This comparison revealed something personal. Churchill admired boldness not only as a strategist, but as a man who had spent his life fighting inertia, fear, and caution. In March 1945, Churchill admitted to Dwight D. Eisenhower that he had misjudged Patton early in the war. "I saw the showmanship," he said, "and missed the substance beneath it. History will remember him as one of the great captains." That judgment did not fade with time. After the war, British military historians examined Bastogne with increasing admiration. The official histories acknowledged that Patton's relief operation ranked among the most impressive operational maneuvers of the conflict. It was taught at staff colleges as a case study in anticipation, decentralized execution, and the weaponization of tempo. German historians reached similar conclusions. In memoirs and post-war analyses, they conceded that by late 1944, the Americans had not only learned German methods of maneuver warfare, they had refined them. Speed, once Germany's greatest advantage, had been turned against them. Churchill absorbed these assessments with characteristic honesty. In his war memoirs, he wrote that Bastogne demonstrated a timeless truth. The best plan, violently executed now, is often better than the perfect plan executed too late. It was a sentiment that echoed Patton more than Montgomery, and that fact was not lost on readers. Perhaps the most telling reflection came years later in a private letter Churchill wrote in the early 1950s. Looking back, he wondered whether British doctrine had been shaped too heavily by fear of loss rather than hunger for decision. "Soundness," he wrote, "may be overrated in warfare." That sentence captured the full arc of his reassessment. The final chapter of this story carries a note of irony. On December 21, 1945, exactly 1 year after Bastogne, George S. Patton died from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. The war was over. The man who had spent his life racing against time was suddenly gone. When Churchill heard the news, he was deeply affected. Publicly, he issued a formal statement praising Patton as a warrior devoted to victory. Privately, he was more emotional. "A great light has gone out," he said. "Men like Patton do not come often. We needed him to win the war. We shall miss him now that it is won." In the years that followed, the lesson of Bastogne continued to shape military thinking across the Western world. During the Cold War, NATO planners emphasized rapid maneuver, decentralized command, and the ability to respond faster than an enemy could exploit success. The idea that speed itself could create strategic advantage became foundational. That intellectual shift traced a clear line back to December 1944 and to a general who treated time as ammunition. Churchill, ever the historian, understood the meaning of that legacy. Bastogne was not merely a rescue. It was proof that the future of warfare belonged to those willing to act before certainty arrived. In the end, Churchill's greatest tribute to Patton was not a speech or a medal. It was a changed mind. He had entered the Ardennes crisis believing caution was the highest virtue of command. He emerged believing that speed, when guided by preparation and will, could decide wars. And that is why the relief of Bastogne endures, not just as a dramatic episode of World War II, but as a turning point in how modern war is fought. Because sometimes, the impossible is not impossible at all. It is simply waiting for someone bold enough to try.